Welcome to the Speak Pact podcast, where high-performing speakers and the producers who hire them merge to give you the insider secrets to the lucrative speaking industry. Antoniette Rose, your podcast host and celebrated speaker agent, unveils insider success strategies. Discover a nexus of thought leaders and bookers, maximizing your potential in each and every episode. Your ticket to ultimate speaking success begins right here. Catch the transformative insights waiting for you on the Speak Pact podcast, hosted by the industry powerhouse herself, Antoniette Rose.
Welcome back to Speak Pact. You are in for a treat today. We have renowned speaker Chris Widener in the house. And he's going to share a pretty astounding journey with us. But in case you haven't heard of him, which is unlikely, Chris is a seasoned businessman. He is a best-selling author of over 25 books in 14 different languages. He is a coach, a consultant, to C-suite level executives. He has also written over 400 articles. Brian Tracy said that Chris Widener is one of the best speakers in America today. So there's a lot of speakers out there. That's saying something. He's a member of the Motivational Speakers Hall of Fame, and he has been named one of the top 50 speakers in the world. He is in one of the top 10 sales speakers named by Success Magazine. Your accolades keep going. We can use the whole time just doing this. And you've worked right alongside Zig Ziglar, one of my champions, John Maxwell, Jim Rohn. And you're just really such a prolific, but also varied speaker. I know you speak on sales, leadership, influence, success, motivation, so many different areas. So tell us about the man when you're just first starting out, Chris, with a few ideas. How do you go from that to where you are now? And I know it's been a bit of a journey for you, but first of all, welcome to the stage. And I cannot wait to dig in.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It was a circuitous route to get here. I grew up crazy upbringing that I won't go into, but 28 homes, 11 different schools. My dad died when I was 4, started drugs in the 6th grade, got shipped off to live with relatives, once in the 4th grade, once in the 9th grade. And I ended up eventually turned everything around, and I ended up becoming a pastor. But I was what they call, and people always say, how did that train you for becoming a professional speaker? Well, you're given at least 3 speeches a week as a pastor, and it's a different speech each time. It's not like you give the same keynote or whatever. But I was what they call a church planter, which means you go into a town where there isn't a church and you start one. And usually there's no money for that. So I decided to do speaking engagements, primarily talking about my life and my upbringing and those kinds of things. As I got older, it translated more into, adult audiences and those kinds of things. And I was always fascinated by leadership. I'd always been a leader. And so I started doing that. And in 2002, I decided to leave the full-time ministry and just write and speak full-time. And I ended up, between 2002, 2009, I ended up working with John Maxwell, who I ghost wrote for, and Zig Ziglar, who I co-hosted a TV show for, and Jim Rohn, who I spent 7 years working with and wrote his last book called 12 Pillars. Mm-hmm. So it was a long, circuitous route. I hired a speaking coach to teach me the business in 1993 or 94, something like that, to show you how old it was, when the first thing he asked me to do was send him a VHS tape of me speaking. And we did all of our phone calls together on a landline. So that's how long ago it was. But it's been a long, circuitous route. I started out charging $500 for a speech, and have increased that significantly to about $40,000 a speech. And so, but there's lots of increments all along the way. I think it went 500, 1,500, 3,000, 4,500, 7,500, 10, 12.5, 15, 22.5. So, as your accomplishments increase, as your books increase, you increase that trajectory of your fees that you charge. And so it was, I wasn't a former well-known CEO. I wasn't an Olympic medal winning athlete. Those guys actually can get into the business a lot easier than us. In fact, I did it the old-fashioned way, not famous. In fact, Forbes magazine wrote an article about how to build a speaking career, and they used me as the example. And it's just that nuts and bolts, grind it out, increase your fees, increase your renown, and all those kinds of things. So I can help people, whether they're, a former CEO or an athlete or those, but I can also help people who maybe nobody knows who they are and they just doing their first book and those kinds of things. So it's been a long route to get here, but it's been enjoyable every step of the way.
And well worth it. Right now, you really
Yeah,
are living
absolutely.
that coveted speaker life. You can say
Yep.
what engagements you want, what engagements you aren't, and $40,000 is not a bad payday. So fabulous. How prolifically are you speaking? I mean, at that level, you can dial it back if you want to. How much is it about the paycheck? How much is it about the impact? And what gets you on the airplane over and above that paycheck?
For me, it's all about impact. In fact, there's some speakers say never give up your fee, never decrease your fee, never discount your fee. But for me, it's more about getting on the road. And so if somebody doesn't have a budget, one of the first things I try to do is I try to get them to find sponsors who might, cover the budget or might balance the budget. They might only have half of the fee, but then they find a sponsor, one of their big vendors or something like that. Sometimes you get them to buy books, to make up that fee. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. I was speaking for a major health company at the Gaylord, just outside of Washington, D.C. And these are the kinds of tricks that a great speaking coach can teach you how to do this. They only had $15,000, or pardon me, yeah, they had $15,000 I was charging $15,000. They only had $10,000. And so I said, well, how many people are going to be there? And they said, there's going to be 400. So I said, do you have an education budget? And they said, yeah, I have an education budget. And I said, okay, what if you pay me 10,000, but I sell you a 4-book pack for each of your 400 people? And so you would end up buying 1,600 books. And they said, sure, that would be great. And I said $20 each for each of the 400. And so it was $8,000 in books. My cost on those books was only $1,600. So think about this. What do you charge, Chris? $15,000. Well, we only have $10,000. Do you have an education budget? Yes. Well, I'll charge you $8,000 for the books. And they said, sure, no problem. So they paid me $18,000 for an event they could have just paid me $15,000 for. But you know how corporate budgets work, right? Well, we only have 10 for the speaker. Oh, but we got a big education budget. So they actually paid me more than what they could have paid me. I'd have come for 15, but they ended up paying me 18. And after the 1,600 fee, for the books, I cleared whatever that is, 16, 16.4 or whatever it was. So.
Well, and so brilliant, because not only are you getting more than you're even asking for in the beginning, but those people now have you in their homes, right? They're not going to say, hi, I remember Chris was just great. I really learned something, but now they've got you right there and will likely be that much more of a fan, but maybe even reach out to you or go look for your other engagements. And I love that you brought up, Chris, that there are other budgets. They don't always let you know there's other budgets, right? There's that L&D, the learning and development budget that you talked about. There's travel budget. We always invoice separately because I know it's coming out of different budgets, and that organizer who chose to bring you in needs to look like a superstar. I got Chris Widener and 40,000, and it doesn't look like they've
Right,
gone
yeah,
over because
absolutely.
they've got the different. Any other budgets we should know about that you've tapped into?
Well, the one thing that I was thinking was, oftentimes, I'll just take a number. Let's say 15, let's say you're charging 15,000. They say, well, we only have 10, but you're speaking at the lunch. So what I would say is, who are your biggest vendors who are going to be there? And they'll say, oh, well, XYZ company, they're the biggest vendor in our industry. Well, why don't you go to the CEO of that vendor or whoever their representative is going to be at that thing you ask them to sponsor the lunch for $5,000. And then that CEO gets to stand up there. They get to, talk about their company for 3 or 4 minutes. They get to introduce me. I recognize them as the sponsor of the lunch. The host of the conference recognizes them as sponsor of the lunch. He gets to tell them to go to the booth and talk to everybody. And that is actually a pretty good strategy for making up. So it's not coming out of the company budget, but it's coming out of the vendor budget. And most vendors have a lot of money, particularly if they're the biggest one in their industry.
I love that you brought that up because that is such an underutilized tool. What you might not know yet, Chris, is before I was a speaker agent, I produced very large scale events.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that it was in the natural wellness space. So I didn't have a huge budget for the speakers, but I wanted the best. And the way that I was able to get the best speakers on my stages is to find vendors to sponsor the speaker, pay the speaker well. And the speaker wouldn't even promote them from the stage, but they would go to their booth and, they're a bit of a celebrity, so they would get to meet them at the booth. But that is so underutilized. Thank you for saying that. There's a lot of different ways that you can use sponsorships. I love the way you said a moment ago that, let's say you come in at $40,000, but they only have $20,000 in their budget, then you encourage them to find a sponsor.
Well, and here's the other thing. You have to look. I remember I was charging $4,500 for a speech. This was a long time ago. And I got a phone call from this gal, and she says, my boss read an article of yours, and we've hired all the other speakers. We have one spot left, but he wants it to be you. And I said, okay, great. And so I went there. And by the way, she said, what do you charge? I said, $4,500. And she said, well, I have $6,000 that I have to use or I won't get it next year. So I'll pay you $6,000. And but there was 180 CEOs in that group, and I booked well over $100,000 worth of gigs at their companies. Another time, in fact, the most money I've ever made in one day from a speaking engagement was a free speech I gave. I was asked to speak to a network marketing company in Brisbane, Australia. I paid my own way. I paid my own hotel. I paid my own food. But network marketers, they love to buy stuff. And I have dozens of audio programs and books and all those kinds of things. And so I showed up, I gave a 45-minute speech to 3,000 network marketers and sold $140,000 worth of books and audio programs. So there's more than one way to get paid. I have a friend who she makes about $6 million a year as a speaker. And she said, I will actually, if it's the right audience, I'll pay them. Now, if you think about that, if you have a coaching program, right, and it's a high-end coaching program and it's the right audience for you, and all the other speakers are saying, well, I'm $15,000, I'm $20,000. And she shows up and says, well, I'll tell you what, not only I don't want you to pay me, but I'll pay you $10,000 to be able to come and speak. And they're like, well, that's a $25,000 swing. But she'll walk out of the room with $250,000 worth of coaching contracts. Yes. And so, the pricing structure, it always used to be, what's your fee? Here's the check, come and speak and see you later. But there's just so many different nuanced ways to price yourself. And the other thing is, you don't want to price yourself differently too often unless you have a great excuse. So, because you don't want somebody to say, well, I paid you $20,000. I just found out that Frank paid you $15,000.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, Frank and I went to high school together. Or, Frank donates a ton of money to a charity that I believe in. Or it's a nurses association. And I say, you know what? Nurses do great work. And so I cut them a deal. There's all sorts of ways, but you always have to be able to justify it to somebody who maybe paid you full rack rate, right? So there's just a lot of little nuances to how you charge. But if Microsoft calls you up, they don't want you selling books. They don't want you doing this. They don't want you doing that. They say, how much do you charge? It's $40,000 plus travel. And they go, who do we make the check out to? So.
Right. Okay. You brought up so many things I don't want to glance over because these are deep insights. Number one, don't be short-sighted. There are many different currencies, and oftentimes those other currencies are worth way more than maybe that other $5,000 that you should have gotten. I would say the average speaker is somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $25,000, 25 being the upper end. There's a very top, maybe 3% of speakers that are making what you're making, but the strategies are the same. Like the principles are all the same with regards to how you're going to get them to make it worth your while to speak at that engagement.
Yeah, it works at any fee level,
Mhm.
really.
So one thing that we do is we always invoice at the speaker's rate. So you're $40,000, but maybe you're going to do an engagement for 20,000 because he was your old college buddy, whatever it might have been. But we still invoice at the 40, and then we line item the reasons. Used to be my best friend,
Yep.
right? Or
Yep.
whatever. Or Tony Robbins' trick. I don't think he has to do it anymore, but he did for years.
Right.
That if I knock it out of the ballpark, you're going to introduce me to 3 of your colleagues or your vendors
Yep.
that might,
Yep.
that's worth way more than that other $5,000, right? So that'd be line itemed in. And then that bottom number is the number that they're actually going to pull out of pocket, but still visually they're seeing, no, he's a $40,000 speaker. So I think that alleviates that kind of comparison thing.
Yep. Well, I'll tell you another thing that I do at this stage of my life. All my kids are gone. My wife is free to travel. And so, they'll say, well, you say 40 and they go, well, we only have 30. And now here's, and this is just personal, I'll say, well, where's the event going to be? And they're like, it's going to be in Cabo San Lucas, or it's going to be in La Jolla, or it's going to be in, Miami Beach or something like that. Now, here's the thing. When you put on a big conference, you get a lot of free rooms, right? The company gets a bunch of rooms, right? And rooms are cheap, even if they have to pay for them. So what I'll say is, oh, my wife loves La Jolla. I'll tell you what, if I'll do it for 30, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick up not just the 2 or 3 nights that you would have me, but I'd like you to can you get me a week at that hotel and pay for the week? And then my wife and I'll just stay around for an extra 4 days. That works. And it makes my wife happy. And we get to have a little vacation, so there's a lot of different ways that you can work this out. And I'll tell you one way I teach some of my coaching clients, and one gal has used it regularly. She's like, oh, I don't know if we can get that much. And if it gets down to where you kind of get it, you might not get it. Here's what I say to people. I say, I'll make you a deal. I really like you, and I like your organization. I like what they do. And you're a new client. I'd love to do this speaking engagement. So if you'll go back to the committee and you'll push as hard as you can, if you'll do the best for me, I'll take it and I'll do the best for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it creates a relationship between the speaker and the meeting planner, because they're like, wow, this is a person who really wants to work with me. They know that I have budget constraints and those kinds of things. I have one of my coaching clients, she's down in Texas. She walked into a group, I think it was a nonprofit group or something like that. And the woman literally started crying when she told her that. She's like, thank you so much for working with us. We'd love to have you, but we just don't have the budget. But I will go and I will get you everything that I possibly can. And she had already said, if you'll do that, I'll take whatever you come back with.
Wow. Okay, such really incredible strategy. So at this point, I'm sure you've got the flow coming in where you're not having to do much, if any, outreach. But in the early days, when your name wasn't as known, and you weren't getting the referrals, what was your strategy? How did you build that momentum?
Calling, mailing, all those kinds of things. One of the things I teach, and we use it ourselves now, we still do outreach. But one of the things that I train our clients on is there's a database of all the associations in America. And I don't know what it costs. It's like $1,500 a year to belong to this. And then I hire a virtual assistant, and she sends out, and this database has every name of every association. It has the person in charge of their events, their phone number, their email, their whatever. And since I teach leadership, we train our VAs to go into that database and just search the word leadership or leaders or managers or management, any of those kinds of terms, right? And she will send the initial email. She CCs my wife, who handles the bookings, and she'll say, hey, I'm just reaching out to you. I see you have a conference coming up. If you hire outside speakers, this is Chris Widener, and please let us know. And then typically the person will reply, and my wife gets the reply because she's on the CC, right? Mm-hmm. She's one of the people on there. And then my wife picks it up and carries it out. And so we send hundreds and hundreds of emails. And I learned this from another speaker. here. He told me how to do it. He was spending, I think he was spending $3,000 a month on VAs, but he was charging $15,000, but he was booking 5 to 6 engagements a month out of that.
Mhm.
So a $3,000 VA sending emails all day, every day was earning him $60,000 to $75,000 a month using this database.
That is deep insight. And we didn't even have this pre-conversation, but a big part of how my agency operates in empowering the actual speaker. So I went from producer to kind of traditional agency style. I didn't love the model when I was a producer dealing with agents to put them on my own stages. And I just didn't love the model. It's kind of a codependency model. Like I just didn't love it. To each his
Yeah.
own, right? Instead, empowering each speaker to do that mass outreach. I love hearing that even at the stage you are, you understand the importance of never letting up on the outreach and the importance of you not doing it yourself, right? You need to have those VAs, but it really is a numbers game. So we make
Yeah,
sure.
I have a friend, one of the top speakers in America. He does over 100 gigs a year and has for 20 years. He spends $10,000 a month on Google AdWords. So when somebody types in leadership speaker or motivational speaker or sales speaker or something like that, he's that advertisement at the top. And like I said, he spends $10,000 a month, but he charges $35,000 for a speech, and he's doing over 100 a year.
So the maths.
The math works.
Wow.
Yeah.
Love it. Love it. So tell me your numbers. This is the numbers that we found. Now you've got you have a proven process. You have a lot behind you, your books, the social proof, all the things. But maybe for an emerging speaker, what our numbers, what we find is it takes about 400 new pitches per month, plus all the follow-ups, which those mount. You and your wife
Yep.
both know those mount up
Yep.
to be pretty big numbers. We have a thing called the gigs engine, where a lot of that you need to treat your business like a business if you're going to be a serious speaker. So there's the software and then the actual doing the thing. But that is the number that we came up with, where we feel like within about the first year, because it's not going to happen overnight, that's when you can pretty much know, like clockwork, you're going to have 3 to 5 good paid opportunities on your calendar. That's our math. Have you found a different ratio with how much output versus how much input to expect?
That's about right, particularly if you're just starting out, that you just have to, it's the same way if you open a sandwich shop. If you open a sandwich shop, you wouldn't just sit on your duff in the kitchen waiting around. You'd go into the Val pack that goes out to everybody in town, and you'd go to the Chamber of Commerce and talk to everybody. You'd speak at the Rotary, you'd speak at the Kiwanis, you'd speak at the Elks, you'd speak at the Lions, you'd speak at the Eagles, every little local group, that's what you would do. You would try to reach out to people and get your name known. No different in the speaking world.
So good. Oh, and one of the big things I think that is a misnomer, seasoned speakers understand this. New speakers don't. I am fabulous. I've got a transformative message. That's enough, right? Just put me on the stage.
Well, I'll tell you what happened when I hired that speaking coach in 1993 or something, and I sent him the VHS tape. The very next time we talked, he said, "Chris, you are one of the greatest speakers I've ever seen. You're funny, you're witty, you're sharp, you change your pace. You are amazing." I was sitting there going, well, look at me, right? And then he said, "Now here's what you need to realize. None of that matters." And I said, "It doesn't matter to be a great speaker?" He goes, "Oh, no, it matters to be a great speaker. It matters nothing in terms of getting the business."
Yes.
Because you will have people who are not half the speaker you are, but they're twice the marketer that you are. And they will get the gig, and those other people will never hear of you and never see you speak. The speaking business is about marketing. Now, there's an old saying in the speakers world: the best marketing is a great speech, right? And I agree. You get off the stage, and everybody, the other regional manager who happens just to be here and he hears you speak, he goes, "Man, I got to bring you into my region." Okay, that's great. It's the same with a sandwich shop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you do the Val Pack, and yeah, you go tell everybody, and yeah, you go to the Chamber of Commerce, and yeah, you do all those things. but a great sandwich will also really help.
True. I love that. And on top of it is makes all the difference, right? It could be a really good sandwich, but if you go in there and the bathrooms aren't clean or whatever, the management isn't there, they're not treating their business like a business. It's also probably so. I think a lot of speakers, even those who say they want to be serious, they treat their speaking like a side gig
Yeah,
versus really like a business. Last question before I want you to let everybody know how they can get you, how they can
sure.
get a hold of you. But what are some essential business pieces that you felt like once I put those in place, things really started regulating for us in a good way?
Well, the first and foremost thing that I do when I coach clients is I tell them to read a book called Positioning. In fact, now I tell them to read the new book, Repositioning. So the original book, Positioning, was written by Jack Trout and Al Reese. The updated version, which even though it's called Repositioning, 2/3 of it is just a reiteration of positioning. So I always tell, buy the new one. And it was just written by Jack Trout. Al Reese was not involved in that second book. But you have to decide who you are in the marketplace. And here's the analogy I always use. If it's 2 PM and you see a toilet, your toilet in your home is leaking all over the place. If you're a poor person, you go to Google and you type in a search term. You type in cheap plumbers because you're a poor person, can't afford, you got to get somebody out there. If you're a rich person and you see the same thing, you go to Google and you type in best plumbers. If it's 2 AM and not 2 PM, and you get up to go to the bathroom and there's toilet water all over the place, it doesn't matter if you're poor or you're rich. You go to Google and you type in emergency plumbers. Each one of those markets is a different position. You have to decide who you are. So sometimes people call up and they go, well, we want you to talk about customer service. And I just say, I don't do customer service. The funny thing is, if you gave me a few days to prepare, I'd come up with a bunch of funny customer service. I'd come up with some amazing customer service. I'd come up with some horrible customer service. I could show up and give a speech, but it's not my position in the marketplace. So I refer them to, other friends of mine who actually do customer service. And they do the same thing for me. So positioning yourself in the marketplace, unless you are, Michael Jordan but even Michael Jordan has a position in the marketplace. He's the greatest basketball player of all time, right? If somebody says, we want an NBA player, let's hire the greatest basketball player of all time. Everybody's going to go, I wonder if Michael Jordan gives speeches, right? And so you have to position yourself in the marketplace. And some of those positioning statements are really interesting. There's a very well-known speaker. I think she probably gets $40,000 a speech now. I don't know her very well, but her position in the marketplace is, I was the first woman to ever land an F-16 on an aircraft carrier at night. That's literally her positioning statement.
Yeah.
So what does that tell you? She's woman, she's military, she's a badass because she flew F-16s, and she did it at the most difficult ways you possibly could. That tells the audience a lot about her and what she's going to bring, right? And so you just have to figure that positioning piece out. When I was working with Jim Rohn was when I first created my first sort of positioning motto or whatever. And I asked Jim, would you give me an endorsement? He said, absolutely. Write one up for me and I'll read it. And if it works, I'll sign off on it. So I had just read the book Positioning, probably for the 5th time. And so I wrote my own and Jim signed off on it. I wrote, Chris Widener is the leader of a new generation of leadership and personal development speakers. That's the endorsement that Jim Rohn gave me. And I crafted it very specifically, the next generation. Because when I did that, Zig Ziglar was still around, Jim Rohn was still around, all these guys, right? Well, and they were all charging, $50,000 to $100,000. And I was, at that time, I was probably $10,000, $12,500 or something like that. So I was setting up in the mind of the buyer, and that's the subtitle of Positioning. It's fighting for the mind space of the market or something like that. If they didn't have $100,000, here's this endorsement from Jim Rohn who says, well, hey, if you're not looking for one of us old guys who've been around for 40 years, this is the new guy. And so that's how I crafted my rise in the speaking world, was with an endorsement from Jim Rohn that positioned it for me. I didn't even have to position myself. Jim Rohn positioned me for the marketplace by
Brilliant.
calling me. And I didn't say Chris Widener is a leader. Chris Widener is the leader of a new generation. And so it talked about, I'm a leader in the marketplace. I'm part of the next generation. I talk about leadership and personal development. So you have to figure out how you're going to go to market. And you have to figure out, if somebody's saying, we're putting on a conference for female executives in the pharmaceutical industry. I don't know who that person is, but I'll bet that there's somebody who has that position in the marketplace. If you're putting on a conference for female leaders in the pharmaceutical space, I'll bet there's somebody who has already carved that niche out. And when they do that, they're always the first person that somebody calls.
So key. I think a lot of speakers come in, they're multi-talented. We are. If we're in this space, we're a bit ADD and we're multi-talented. But if you're the CEO or the event organizer that's going to spend $15, $20, $25,000 on someone, you don't want a speaker or a expert. You want the expert, that subject matter recognized to be an expert in that space. They don't have to be a recognized name. They have to be recognized as an expert in that space. So glad you brought that up. How do you help speakers, and how do they get a hold of you?
So I do a 1-year speaker training, and it covers everything from the very first thing, like I just told you. We start out with positioning. Then we talk about branding. I've published 25 books. We talk about writing your book. I help you get that. We make sure that your speech is crafted. I make sure that you have a 15-minute speech, a 45-minute speech, a 60-minute speech, and a 90-minute speech. And I teach you how to make it plug and play. So if I'm talking about, 12 Pillars, which is the book I wrote with Jim Rohn, I can do all 12 of them in 90 minutes, and I got certain different stories. But if they tell me, well, you only have 60 minutes, I might pick, 8 of them. If they tell me I have 45, I'm only doing 6 of them. If they tell me I have 15, I'm only doing 2 of them. But the stories for the 2, the 6, the 8, the 12, the stories are all the same. So all I have to do is just pull the pieces out, squish them together, and it fits that time frame.
Yeah.
So I help them with their speech. I help them with their the various forms in which you sell your information. In fact, in a way, the speaking business is not really the speaking business. Speaking is a part of the information business, and people pay you differently based on the form that you give them the information. I'll give you a good example. If I write an article on one of the 12 pillars, I make nothing unless somebody says, oh, I want to hire this guy. If I sell a book of 12 pillars, I make Jim Rohn and I split, his estate now, we split 15%. So, it sells for 10, it's $1.50. I make 75 cents on every book that gets sold. If I do an audio program, I think the 12 Pillars audio program is $69, minus cost, blah, blah, blah. I make $60. If I do a course on it, like a video course, I might sell that. You could sell a course anywhere between $149 and $499.
Yeah.
Now I make that. If I do a workshop, I might charge, $7,500, all the way up to a keynote, of $40,000. So what's interesting is it's all the same information, but I teach you how to create different formats so you can make a whole bunch of different levels of money. Of course, the goal is always to end up with the keynote. The irony of that is you probably get the most information out of the audio program for $69.95.
Right.
And yet they want you to show up and give a speech, and they pay you a lot more because you give a lot more for that. But but that's what I teach them. I teach them marketing. One of the big things right now is there's so many speakers in the marketplace. I know one speakers bureau has 20,000 speakers in their database.
Yeah.
So what I'm teaching people a lot now is to develop your own tribe and monetize your own tribe.
Mm-hmm.
And there's guys like that out there who've done that. You just get on the internet and scroll for a while on Facebook, and you'll find them. And it doesn't matter what industry they're in. You could say, well, I'm gonna give speeches to car dealers and car salesmen. Okay, great. What's better than $25,000, to do that is having 50,000 real estate agents paying you $20 a month to belong to your your program,
Yep.
right? That's a lot more money than even getting out on the road. So building your tribe so that you can monetize them. And then you can always put on your own conferences and speak at your own conferences, but it allows you to sell them books. It allows them to sell coaching. It allows them group coaching, individual coaching, keynotes, all those kinds of things. So
Starting your own podcast, I think, is another
starting your own
really great way to
podcast.
do that.
And
So
we
much
talk
goodness.
about
I
that
could
as
go on
well.
for another hour with you. I know you have a hard stop. So
No problem. But I want to tell them how they can get a hold of me. Chris at
yes.
chriswidener.com. Very
Okay.
easy.
So
Chris at chriswidener.com.
Widener,
Yeah.
Widener for those who are, and you're on LinkedIn, you're everywhere.
LinkedIn. Yeah, I'm
just
everywhere.
Google his name, you'll find him. Okay, Chris, so fabulous. Really quick, if you could do this in 1 minute, because I know you're going to need to go.
Yep.
What is one strategy you can give our audience, if they did nothing else, that is going to really move the needle for them in the next 3 months in their speaking career?
Well, I'm going to give you a bonus, and I'll even stay a little extra longer. One is use the association model that I just described. It's the quickest way to get to buyers. But I'm going to give you a better piece of advice, and it's not a strategy. I'll tell you a weird story. Weirdest story in my life. I was at a conference one time, and you know how you're at a conference, you don't know anybody, and I'm sitting there drinking my coffee, and I turn around and I come face to face with these two women. One was about 55, the other was about 30. The 30-year-old looks at me like this. And the other woman, who I found out later was her mother, she looks at her, she looks at me, she looks at her, she looks at me, she looks at her and says, "Is that him?" And she goes. And the mother then looks at me and says, 2 a.m. last night, my wife woke up in the middle of the night. And this was, by the way, I was 24 years old when this happened. The daughter woke up in the middle of the night in the hotel room at 2 a.m. She woke her mother up and said, "I just had the most vivid dream. I saw a man's face and I had a message that I'm supposed to tell him." That morning, I turned around right in front of her. She looked at my face and looked like she saw a ghost. And so the mother says, "Well, if that's him, tell him." And she gave me a piece of advice that I have lived with, and it's a great piece of advice for speakers. She said, "I'm supposed to tell you to be a voice, not an echo."
Mm.
That's it. That's the only, and I have lived with that piece of advice for, this was 1991 or 92. No, it was earlier than that. It was like 1990. So I was 24 years old or something like that. Don't just regurgitate other people's stuff. Don't just read a bunch of other books and then, put it all into your speech. Do your own thinking. Come to your own conclusions. Say something that somebody else isn't thinking. I have a good friend, Mark Sanborn, one of the top speakers in America. And he says, the problem with most thought leaders? They don't do a lot of thinking. Mark, for 30-something years, takes 15 minutes every single day with nothing but himself, a pen, and a yellow legal pad. And he thinks for 15 minutes a day by himself in the quiet so that he can be a voice, not an echo. And what's going to differentiate you from everybody else who's just saying the same thing that they read in some other book or they heard some other speaker, be unique, be a voice, not an echo. That I think is one of the things that will definitely separate you from everybody else.
Perfection. Perfect way to end. Thank you so much for your time today, Chris. I don't know how anybody else didn't take 50 pages of notes like I did. That's so much out of this, and I'm in the industry, so thank you for bringing your wisdom.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Ciao for now.
Thank you for listening to the Speak Pact podcast. To become a recommended speaker of Antoniette's WPC speaker agency, or you are a host or planner looking for a dynamic expert in optimized performance, Antoniette would like to personally meet with you. Secure a time with her at speakerbooker.com. Again, that is speakerbooker.com. It all begins with a vision, a voice, and a pact to impact. Join the Speak Pact movement by joining our new private Facebook group at the link in our show notes. Find us on nearly every social media platform at One Antoniette. That's number 1, ANTONIETTE, or simply #SpeakPact.